January 9th, 1987. A hospital room in Innsbruck, Austria, 4 in the morning. The room was quiet the way hospital rooms are quiet. Not peaceful, just emptied of everything except the sound of machines and the particular stillness that arrives when a human body has decided for now to stay. There was a plastic plug in his skull. That is where we begin, not with the fall, we'll get to the fall, but with the plug. A small piece of surgical-grade material approximately the size of a coin, inserted where the bone had been removed after a fragment entered his brain on a hillside in Yugoslavia 8 months earlier. The doctors in Innsbruck who reviewed his file that January did not comment on it. Not because it was unremarkable, but because at a certain point in Jackie Chan's medical history, the accumulation of what had been broken and repaired and broken again became its own kind of language that required a different framework to read. He was 32 years old. He had already broken his nose multiple times. His cheekbone had been dislocated and reset. His pelvis had been dislocated during a stunt at a shopping mall in Suan 2 years earlier. A slide down a pole strung with electrical lights that burned both his palms on the way down. His fingers had been broken in numbers he had stopped specifying because the exact count felt less important than the general condition they described. Hands that had been rebuilt so many times that the morning stiffness in them had become a kind of weather report, telling him what temperature it was outside before he looked at a window. And that was before Yugoslavia. I need to be honest with you about something before this story goes further. When you research Jackie Chan's injuries, really research them, not the greatest hits version that surfaces in magazine retrospectives, but the full catalog, you encounter a problem that is not the problem you expect. The problem is not incompleteness. There is actually quite a lot of documentation, his autobiography, decades of interviews, the testimony of crew members and stunt coordinators who worked alongside him across 40 years of production. The problem is absorption. You read the list, and at some point the list stops functioning as information and becomes something else. A skull fracture, a sternum, a spine, a nose broken and reset and broken again, the pelvis, the ankle finished on camera in a cast painted to look like a shoe. Every bone. He said it himself in interviews that accumulated over decades, in the specific matter-of-fact tone of someone who had decided that the only honest way to discuss these things was without the inflection that would make them sound like complaint. There is not a single bone in his body he has not broken at least once. I sat with that sentence for a while before continuing, not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of the tone, because of the specific absence of drama in it. Because whoever Jackie Chan became over the course of his career, the man who could say that sentence in that tone had learned something about pain that I suspect most of us have not been required to learn. The question this script set out to ask is a simple one. What does a body remember when the person inside it will not stop? To understand the answer, you have to go back further than Yugoslavia. You have to go back to where it started, Hong Kong, 1961. He was 7 years old. The China Drama Academy stood in a part of the city where the buildings pressed close enough that in summer the air between them stopped moving. It was run by Master Yu Jim Yuen, a man who operated in a tradition of physical instruction that had not softened for generations and was not going to soften now. The students signed in, their parents signed. Whatever was going to happen to their children's bodies over the following decade, the paperwork was in order. The wooden floors of the practice hall had been worn to a particular smoothness by decades of feet and falls, and the dragging of weight from one end to the other. In the early morning, 5:30, the light came in low and caught the grain of the wood in a way that would have been almost beautiful if anyone had been awake enough to notice. They were not. The smell of the place was liniment and effort, a combination that does not fully air out even when the windows are open, which they often were not because there was no budget for heating, and open windows in winter made the cold worse. The music that accompanied training, strings, percussion, the specific instrumentation of Peking opera, became so inseparable from the physical work that years later, in film studios and hospital rooms and green rooms on 3 continents, former Academy students reported that certain passages of that music produced an involuntary physical response. The body had been trained so thoroughly and for so long that it retained the connection between the sound and the state the sound accompanied, ready, always ready, regardless of what readiness cost. The boy who would eventually be known as Jackie Chan was known then as Chan Kong Sang. He was 7 years old and small for his age, and the Academy's training was already producing in him the thing it was designed to produce. A body that could do what bodies are not naturally built to do, governed by a will that had been systematically taught that the body's limits were negotiable. He was not alone. Sammo Hung was there, a few years older, already a presence. Yuan Biao, younger, would follow. The 3 of them would build something between them in that practice hall and in the dormitory where they slept on thin mats in rows 4 and 5 hours a night when they were lucky, the exhaustion so constant and complete that it stopped registering as exhaustion and simply became the texture of being alive. What they built between them, the specific and indelible bond of people who went through extreme things together when they were children, is the kind of thing that does not require language to maintain. Decades later, when they appeared together on screen, the audience could feel it without being able to name it. It was the residue of the Academy. It never fully leaves. Here is where the accounts begin to diverge, and I want to be straight with you about that. What follows is assembled from sources that broadly agree on the main events and sometimes sharply disagree on the details. His autobiography, published in 1998 and written with Jeff Yang, gives his account, which is candid in ways that surprised me when I first read it. Crew members from different productions describe a man who was consistent in certain ways and deeply contradictory in others. The physical record, the x-rays, the surgical reports, the cast painted to look like a shoe, those are not disputed. What is harder to reconstruct is the interior, what he understood about what he was doing to himself and when he understood it and what he decided to do with that understanding. There are 2 versions of this that I have encountered, and I am not confident which one is true, and it is possible they are both true in different proportions at different times of his life. The first version is the one he gave most often in public. The injuries were the price of the work was what he was born to do, and the price was worth paying because the alternative, not doing the work, not doing it this way, doing it safely with wires and padding and the camera positioned to make the ordinary look extraordinary, was a kind of dishonesty he could not commit. In this version, the skull fracture and the broken bones and the cast painted to look like a shoe are the evidence of a man who believed in something enough to pay for it. The second version is more complicated and surfaces more rarely in interviews late at night or at the end of long conversations when the public-facing version has been given enough times that it starts to loosen. In this version, the decision to keep going, to return to the set with the ankle that had been broken for 11 days, to slide down the pole a second time after the first time burned his hands, to stand on the hillside in Yugoslavia and do the take that fractured his skull, was not always a considered philosophical choice. Sometimes it was simply what was expected of him. Sometimes it was the only identity he had. Sometimes, and this is the part that stays with me, it was the one thing he knew how to do that no one else could do the way he did it. and stopping would have required becoming someone he did not know how to be. The shopping mall was in Suen Wan, November 1985. Police Story had been his project from the beginning. He was writer, director, and star, which in the Hong Kong film economy of the mid-1980s was both necessary and insane in approximately equal measure. The film's budget was the kind of budget that meant you did not have the option of not getting the shot. The sets were real locations. The mall was a real mall. The glass was real glass. The electrical lights strung around the pole were connected to a real circuit. The pyrotechnics team had calculated the timing. The stunt team had walked through it. Jackie Chan walked through it, and then he did it. He weighed at that point in his life approximately what he always weighed, wiry and compact, the body of someone who had been physically trained since age 7 and had never stopped. He grabbed the pole and went down, and the lights burned his hands the way the production meeting had said they would, and at the bottom the impact to his pelvis was harder than the planning had accounted for. His vision went white at the edges for a moment that felt longer than it was. The crew, 20, maybe 30 people in positions around the mall, stood in the specific silence that film crews stand in immediately after a dangerous take, the silence that is waiting to find out what just happened. He stood up. That was the take they used. In the days after, he shot additional footage with his hands wrapped. The pelvis would heal. It would take longer than the production schedule allowed. So the production schedule adjusted, which is not the same as the injury adjusting. The difference between those two things, the schedule bending to accommodate what the body needed and the body continuing regardless of what the body needed, was a distinction that Jackie Chan had been making since he was 7 years old on a wooden floor in Hong Kong that smelled of liniment and effort. The film was released in 1985. The shopping mall sequence became one of the most discussed practical stunt sequences in film history. The audience watching it understood they were seeing something real. What they were seeing exactly, the specific mixture of skill and will and institutional pressure, and the particular psychology of a man who had been taught since childhood that his body's objections were negotiable, that was more complicated to see from the outside. Yugoslavia, August 1986. Armor of God was filming on a hillside that had a different quality of cold than Hong Kong, drier, sharper, the kind of cold that comes from altitude rather than damp. The stone buildings visible from the location were older and heavier than anything he had grown up around, built from materials that assumed permanence in a way Hong Kong's construction did not. The local crew members who had been hired for the production watched the Hong Kong crew work with an expression that the Hong Kong crew recognized from every international production they had done: genuine disbelief. This was not how films were made. This was not how this was done. The take required a jump from a castle wall to a tree branch. It was not, by the standards of what Jackie Chan had already filmed in his career, an unusually dangerous stunt. He had done more dangerous things on domestic productions with smaller crews and less preparation. The calculation was familiar. The tree branch was the variable. It gave way. He fell. The distance to the ground was enough to produce a specific kind of impact, and in the impact his head struck a rock with the force that it struck it, and the result was a skull fracture with a fragment of bone that had entered the brain tissue and was identified in the emergency surgery that followed. The surgery removed what needed to be removed. The hole left behind was covered with the plastic plug that would remain there for the rest of his life. "The best stunt is the one the audience believes," he said once in an interview that I cannot precisely date. "The second best is the one that nearly kills you." Usually they are the same stunt. He was not speaking about Yugoslavia specifically. He was speaking about everything. The fragment that entered his brain produced, in the years following, a partial hearing loss in his right ear. He finished the film. Armor of God was released in 1986 and performed well commercially. The production records confirm the location, the timeline, the nature of the injury, and the surgery. What the records do not contain is what he thought about in that hospital room in Innsbruck, with the machines and the quiet, in the specific hours before the Austrian winter light came through the window and the day began. I want to ask you something directly, and I mean it as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. At what point does willingness to endure become something different? Not the public version of the question, the inspirational one, the one about dedication and craft and the price of excellence, the private version, the one that does not have a clean answer. Because here is what the record shows. The record shows a man who, across 4 decades, sustained injuries that would have ended most people's careers after the first or second occurrence, and who returned each time to the same work in the same way. The record also shows that this man was trained from the age of 7 in an institution that systematically taught him that his body's limitations were obstacles to be overcome rather than signals to be heeded, that the people who trained him used physical punishment as a pedagogical tool, that the system he entered as a child did not have a mechanism for saying stop. The record does not show us what he thought about this. His autobiography is honest about the pain and remarkably reticent about the psychology of choosing again and again to continue. I think, and this is my interpretation, not documented fact, that the reticence is itself information, that there are things he understood about himself and his choices that were more complicated to articulate than the straightforward version, and that the straightforward version served him in ways the complicated version would not have. What I keep returning to is not Yugoslavia. What I keep returning to is the ankle. January 1995. Vancouver, British Columbia, dressed to look like New York. Rumble in the Bronx was filming in the specific cold of a Canadian winter that the story pretended was autumn in the Bronx. Jackie Chan jumped from a hovercraft to a warehouse. The ankle broke on landing. Clean fracture, documented. The kind of injury that produces a specific audible and physical signal that everyone present understands immediately. He was back on set within days. The ankle was in a cast. The cast was painted to match the color of his shoe. If you know to look for it, you can see it in the film. If you do not know to look for it, you see a man running through a story about physical invincibility, and the cast painted to look like a shoe is invisible, which was the point. The stunt coordinator on that production. I am not going to attribute this to a specific person because the attribution is not something I can fully verify, is said to have watched him run a take on the painted cast and said something to someone standing next to him. What he said was not about the ankle. It was about the expression on Jackie Chan's face while he was running. He said there was something in it that was not performance, that the face of the character and the face of the man running on a broken ankle in a painted cast had in that take become the same face. I do not know exactly what to do with that. There is a question that this research kept circling back to, and I want to put it to you directly, because I think it is the most important question this story raises, and I do not have a complete answer. The injuries are documented. The decisions to continue are documented. The training that produced the psychology behind those decisions is documented. What is not documented, what may not be documentable, is the relationship between them. Whether the man who slid down the burning pole and finished the film on the broken ankle and returned from Yugoslavia with a plug in his skull was exercising extraordinary will, or whether he was operating from a template installed in him so thoroughly and so early that the exercise of will and the absence of a workable alternative had become, from the inside, indistinguishable. His school brothers, Sammo Hung, Yuan Biao, carry versions of the same template. They came out of the same wooden-floored room that smelled of liniment, slept the same 4 hours on the same thin mats, learned in the same way that the body's limits were a negotiation rather than a boundary. They each made their own peace with what the Academy put in them. None of them, as far as the record shows, made exactly the same peace. Jackie Chan's version involved a screen career of extraordinary physical honesty. The films are the record of what the Academy produced in him, run through 40 years of professional development and global audiences and his own considerable creative intelligence. Every scar visible in the outtakes that play over his end credits is real. The winces are real. The specific way his face moves when he is suppressing pain that is still present while he has to be funny, the audience can see it even if they cannot name it. That is also real. I have broken almost every part of my body, he said, but I have never broken my word. That sentence appears in various forms across his interviews over the decades. It is, I think, the most revealing thing he ever said about himself. Not because of the second half, which is the part that sounds like a declaration, but because of the first half, which he delivered the way you report a weather condition. As if the breaking were simply a feature of the life, neither remarkable nor lamented, simply true. The question that remains, the one I am leaving with you because I cannot answer it, is whether a man can fully separate those two things, whether the commitment that built one of the most physically honest bodies of work in film history was made freely, or whether freedom is a more complicated word than it appears when applied to someone whose relationship with pain and continuation was installed before he was old enough to evaluate it. The skull has a plug in it, the ankle healed, the career continued. What we are left with is the films, and the outtakes, and the list of bones, and the specific tone of voice in which he discusses all of it, a tone that contains, if you listen carefully enough, not quite resignation and not quite pride, but something in between that neither word captures, a tone that suggests a man who has made his accounting and arrived at terms he can live with, and is too honest to pretend those terms were simple, and too private to tell you exactly what they cost. That, I think, is the real story behind every scar. Not that he was invincible, that he was not, and continued anyway, and that the gap between those two things is where his actual life lived.